Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching A 30 Years' War and a Drunky Boy by Historically. Now we haven't reacted to this channel before, but the 30 Years' War is an absolutely fascinating historical event, which I'd like to cover more on this channel. Now, I believe, if I had to guess, the Drunky Boy in the title is probably referring to John George I, Elector of Saxony, whose nickname was Beer George. Truly one of the greatest nicknames of all time, in my opinion. This is a really interesting conflict. There is a lot to talk about, and I'm excited to get into it. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Welcome to A Time of Religion. Oh hey, would you look at that? It's Martin Luther, the
Oh.
local German monk. I see that he is carrying a list of some sort.
Uh-oh.
And he's now nailing it onto the Castle Church of Wittenberg. Can we zoom into that, please? A bit more. And enhance. Enhance again. There we go. 95 reasons why the Catholic Church sucks. Oh, those are some hefty and maybe even legitimate claims against the current regime.
Yeah, Martin Luther was a little bit angry, okay? In 1517, he comes out with his 95 Theses, laying out all the reasons why the Catholic hierarchy sucks. Now, to be fair, Martin Luther does not set out to split off an entirely new branch of Christianity. That is not his goal. His goal is to reform the church, right? He feels like he's been stifled. He posts these in public, very famously. He publishes them. Right? Martin Luther is taking advantage of this printing revolution with the printing press and the Gutenberg Bible and all this type of stuff. He's writing for a much wider audience than previously, and he's writing about all his issues with the Catholic Church. Once again, not to destroy the church, but simply to reform it. However, for Martin Luther, that's not going to happen. He will not be able to make those reforms of the church, and in fact, events are really going to get out of hand pretty quickly.
Guards, get rid of it. Phew, crisis averted. Let's check up on Martin again. Oh no. Well, at least our Holy Roman Empire is fine.
Uh-oh.
Sir, there's been a massive riot going on that's widely spreading across the entirety of Central Europe. What do we do? Ich habe noch ein Ass im Ärmel. Prost! Historically Facts, Part 3.
Oh, man.
This moment, without Martin Luther or anyone else knowing, instigated the start of a 120-year series of long conflicts, with a grand finale known as the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, like they said, without Martin Luther knowing, this was not his intent. But he starts the Reformation, and he begins these European religious wars that culminate with the 30 Years' War, which I imagine what we'll be talking about today, mostly. But, of course, it's not the first conflict that breaks out. There's a lot of fighting done even before the 30 Years' War throughout this entire time period here, right? So it really leads to this era of pretty intense religious violence all throughout Europe.
One of the most complex, longest, and destructive wars ever in European history. You see, Luther's work essentially split the entire Catholic Church in two. And to make sure we are all on the same page, here are some quick differences between the two. Catholics believe that the Pope has the highest authority in the Church, while Protestants believe that the Bible is the most important source of guidance.
Yeah, I mean, look, and once again, Martin Luther was not necessarily intending all of this when he began, but the split that occurs between Catholics and Protestants, what it really becomes is a split between the Catholics who rely more on their hierarchical institutions, right? You access the Word of God through your priest, and many people could not read at that time, so they really needed to. The Pope is the ultimate authority, versus Protestantism, which is a bit more individualistic. You don't necessarily need to go through a church hierarchy to get to God, though it does depend on which denomination of Protestantism you're talking about. They're very different. It's incredibly complex, but generally we're talking about a more individualistic relationship between you and God, one that doesn't necessarily need to be mediated. Typically less hierarchical, though once again that does depend on the denomination. And one of the reasons this really takes off, is because, well, a lot of people still couldn't read, but with the printing press, all these books being printed, education, more people could read at this point than in previous years throughout medieval Europe. And so you had this growing reading public, especially as Bibles were being printed in vernacular German, say, or English or whatever. It allowed people to engage with the word of the Bible on their own for the very first time, in a way they couldn't when the Bible was, say, only Latin. Then, even if you can read your own language, which is, say, German, or a type of German, well, you can't read the Bible if it's Latin. You got to go through your priest. Well, now, the Bible's in German. You can read it, right? So, there's some of the broad differences there.
Catholics believe in order to be saved and go to heaven, a person needs to have faith in God and also do good things like participating in religious rituals. Protestants, on the other hand, argue that simply having faith in Jesus and in His grace is enough to be saved.
Yeah, it's the big debate between sort of faith and works, as in, is faith alone enough? Or does your faith need to drive you to do good works? Right? Which of these sends you to heaven? Or do you believe in predestination? A fair amount of Protestants do. The idea that those who are going to heaven are predestined from the beginning. For example, a lot of the Puritans believed that. Calvinists, right? I mean, it's all very complicated. There's some really in-depth religious struggles, debates here, right?
This also means that while Catholics have 7 special religious rituals, Protestants only have 2. There are also some other things, but in short, Catholics enjoy the fancy things, while Protestants are a lot simpler.
Yeah.
But more important...
Though once again, it does depend on what you're looking at, right? If you look at the Anglican Church in England, now they are technically Protestant, but the Anglican Church really kept a lot of the rituals from the Catholic Church. So in an instance like that, they are a lot closer together. If you look at, say, the Quakers, they're quite different from Catholics. They go really far in the sort of humble, grounded direction, right? So it can depend on which denomination you're looking at.
Germans like the ideas that people like Martin Luther and John Calvin preached, and accompanied with the technology also known as the printing press.
Yep.
Protestantism spread rapidly all across Germany and Europe alike. This part of Christian history is also known as the Reformation, the response to the Reformation.
And I mean, these ideas will spread throughout Europe, of course, and beyond. But when we're talking about really the height of the warfare, the 30 Years' War, that's really going to be centered around Germany. Now, of course, there is no state of Germany. You have a bunch of different principalities, bishoprics, polities that are united under the Holy Roman Empire. So when I talk about Germany, I'm not really talking about a country or a state at this point. I'm talking about a region, right? This area, which we would look at as the country of Germany today, plus some other territories, that is where a lot of the fighting is going to be centered.
Was very diverse. While countries like England, Scotland, the Netherlands, the Nordic Gang, and parts of Switzerland and Germany all adopted Protestant beliefs, the remaining parts of Germany and Switzerland, together with Spain, Italy, France, Portugal, Austria, Poland, Ireland, and the Southern European squad, heavily rejected this new branch instead.
Yes, though, of course, a lot of your Balkan squad would have been Orthodox, not Catholic, right? So you've still got that split there. Although, I mean, of course, within the Balkans, you've got a mix of different religions. I mean, of course, Islam, but even among the Christians, you, of course, have some Catholics, especially the closer you get towards the north, say in Croatia, but especially when you get more towards Greece or Serbia, you're going to have a lot more Orthodox Christians.
And by doing so, started the next part of Christian history, also known as the Counter-Reformation. Should be pretty self-explanatory to what happens next. Time to combat those heretics, Spain proudly said as the Spanish Inquisition intensified. But also, let's have a serious look at some of the corruption and questioned ethics the Protestants criticize us on, said many Catholic bishops and theologians who came together during the Council of Trent. And that was a success.
Yeah, I mean, look, you look at all the sort of critiques the Protestants had. The Catholic Church does not deal with all of them, but there is a degree of reform that happens. Now, it's not enough, right? It's this sort of the too little, too late type situation where by the time the church is getting around to some reform, there's already been this massive split. But of course, the Catholic Church is not an entirely stagnant institution. Martin Luther may have felt it was a bit stagnant and inflexible, but it did manage to change somewhat over time. But that does not stop this split, and that does not stop the warfare that will happen between Protestants and Catholics.
The Catholic Church reaffirmed its teachings and clarified the importance of the sacraments, the role of goods in salvation, and everything else the Protestants challenged. But like we have seen with most religious disputes in history, peace is never an option. Tensions kept rising between the countries, but also internally against each other. And nowhere were tensions as high.
It is true, but I would also argue that oftentimes this sort of ideology of religion is masking some real political struggles, right? You'll see with the 30 Years' War, it's largely framed as a Protestant versus Catholic struggle, which is fair, right? That is accurate, but you do see some powers, some Protestant powers siding with the Catholics, some Catholic powers siding with the Protestants. France, more prominently, which was one of the major Catholic powers at that time. And so, it's not always all about sort of faith, right? Sometimes faith can be a cover for example, France wanting to challenge the dominance of the Austrians, the other big Catholic power. And so, yes, of course, these wars are suffused with religious ideology, and religion, of course, was a motivating factor. But keep in mind, there were a lot of motivations for people to get out there and these states to start fighting each other.
As in the Germanic countries. Even though the Holy Roman Empire was officially a Catholic empire, not all religions were fully Catholic. The Protestant regions came together to establish the Protestant Union, also known as the Evangelical Union, which, by the way, sounds really cool. And in response, the Catholic regions established the slightly lamer named Catholic League. No longer were families both German. They were now Catholic or Protestant.
Yeah.
And because of that, Botgert wouldn't be able
to... And this was especially contentious in Germany, in part because, at this time, how it sort of worked is the ruler of your state would determine the official religion of the state, the kingdom, whatever. Now, look, that didn't mean that if you converted, every person in the state actually converted, but that was the expectation, right? That's how things were thought to have worked. Now, when you look at the Holy Roman Empire, you have a bunch of really tiny states. And so it's very easy, and hundreds of them, it's very easy for a bunch of these, electors, rulers, kings, whomever, and we talk about electors, we're talking about electors to the Holy Roman Empire for the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Those electors, aka leaders of these different states. It's very easy for a lot of them to say, we're Protestant now. And that's obviously going to cause conflict with the ones that stay Catholic. And of course, some of these little polities were bishoprics, right? They were inherently religious in nature. So this causes a lot of conflict in the Holy Roman Empire in particular. Now, there's conflict elsewhere, but oftentimes it could be a bit more internal, right? Like this conflict is going to escalate into a massive, gigantic war. France has religious wars of its own. They're often a little more contained to France itself, right? Where you're talking about within France, you've got Protestants versus Catholics, a lot of that type of stuff. With this, in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, you're talking about state versus state, prince versus prince, etc., etc.
Date trouw, because she was a filthy Catholic. Instead, he would have been forced to date Griet, since she was a good Protestant girl. I'm sure this example perfectly visualizes how deep and severe the tensions cut at the time.
What the hell?
This is John George I.
Yes!
And the lucky boy he was.
I was right.
He was born the eldest son of Duke Christian I.
I knew we were talking... When they said a drunky boy in the title, I knew we were talking about John George, Elector of Saxony, Beer George. Just a fantastic nickname.
First of Saxony. In English, that means he was the successor of the Saxony region in the Holy Roman Empire. And for you Americans, it means he was the one to be governor. After John's dad passed away and his uncle who had the same name took reign for a limited time, it was time for Johnny Boy to be the next duke. So, what did he inherit?
This is a pretty important region, right? And especially in the upcoming 30 Years' War, it's going to be a very important region.
Exactly. Oh no.
Yeah.
Look at it that out of the over 300 territories that he could have inherited, he inherited the one with Wittenberg in it. The same city where Martin Luther nailed his one-star review on the door of the church 100 years ago. The same city that was the heart of Protestantism. That must have been stressful for John. I'm sure he will find a perfectly safe and widely accepted coping mechanism to deal with all that horrible stress. For no particular reason whatsoever, let's have a look at the Kingdom of Bohemia. Isn't Prague a beautiful city? The kingdom itself was dominantly Protestant. But in Prague, while the majority was also Protestant, the elites were not.
Yeah, I like the for no reason whatsoever. Yeah, it's not like this is where everything's going to kick off.
And one day, the Protestants had enough of the Catholic suppression. They stormed the Prague castle and threw 2 Catholic regents and their secretary out of the windows of the chancellery.
Yes, we call it the Defenestration of Prague. And there was more than one, by the way. Defenestration means to be thrown out a window, right? So here we go. This is where everything kicks off. And I will note at this point, there had already been conflict beforehand, right? I think maybe the first conflict after the Reformation begins is the German Peasants' War back in, I think, 1524-25, right? Which is this massive peasants' uprising throughout Germany that ends up being repressed, I think in part because some of these Protestant leaders like Martin Luther actually side against it, right? But the point being, there had already been a lot of conflict, and so what we're seeing here is really the largest scale conflict kicking off, but not the first conflict after the Reformation.
This, by the way, was not the first time that the people of Prague threw government officials out of buildings.
They love doing it.
Almost exactly 200 years ago, they did the exact same thing, but then in their local town hall, which back then marked the beginning of the rebellion against the Catholic Church and the ruling elites. I wonder if this time it will also spark something.
Yeah, I wonder.
The 30 Years' War can be split up in 4 phases, with every jump up in phase massively escalating the severity and scale of the entire conflict.
Yeah.
So let's zoom in and look at phase 1. The Kingdom of Bohemia, where Catholics just got thrown out of windows by Protestants, was, like said before, predominantly Protestant. That must mean that they will surely win this little rebellion of theirs, right? No, they didn't. As a matter of fact, they were absolutely destroyed. The Catholic League didn't want the Protestant Union to gain more power.
Yeah, I mean, you've got Catholic authorities in Bohemia. Additionally, as we talked about, the Holy Roman Empire, it is technically a Catholic institution, and the Holy Roman Emperor is a Catholic himself, right? So, if you're a Protestant, you're sort of the underdog in this battle, and so it's going to be difficult for you to get a foothold. Now, we'll see lots of Protestant victories throughout this conflict, but you're sort of starting off at a bit of a disadvantage, though perhaps momentum is on your side since the Reformation.
So they activated the one who shall not be made fun of. The Habsburgs,
Jesus.
Also known as the nowadays Swiss. The Habsburgs had a lot of power and territory, not only in the Holy Roman Empire, but also in Spain, Portugal, parts of France, and Italy.
Yeah, I mean, the Habsburgs, I think oftentimes we associate them most explicitly with Austria, which is fair, right? But the Habsburgs are really one of, if not the most powerful family in Europe at this point. They have an incredible amount of territory. Now, I will say, but they had that territory did not always mean those territories were working together, right, to be fair. But they still controlled a lot of territory, a lot of wealth, a lot of power, right? And the Habsburgs are sort of competing with, say, France to be the #1 Catholic power at this point. Well, yeah, you could make an argument for either, I think. But the Habsburgs are also the sort of de facto emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not official that it had to be a Habsburg every time, but it was. You know what I mean? So they're sort of the big dog, really throughout Europe, but especially in Central Europe.
That's one strong dynasty. How did they achieve that? Well, with 2 simple tricks. Smart marriage proposals, and excessive inbreeding so they wouldn't lose it. The Protestant Union, like everyone else in Europe, was pretty wary of them, and no one was stupid enough to risk a direct confrontation with them. That is also why our boy John George decided to stay neutral in this conflict, even though he did provide a little bit of support to the Protestants' cause.
Yeah, we'll see Beer George. I will keep calling him that because it's a great nickname, and I believe he was nicknamed that during his lifetime. But Beer George, he, maybe not the greatest leader you've ever seen. Now, I'd say also not the worst, right? I'm not trying to hate on the guy. Beer George was always sort of going for usually peace. You could say, I don't know if like centrist or moderate is the right word, but he was involved. He didn't ever really want to be involved that bad. He would sort of rather have remained out of it, remained at peace. Now, in the end, that wasn't really an option for old Beer George. That's sort of what he wants this whole time.
Anyway, even though the other Protestant regions sent military support to help the Bohemian rebels, the Habsburgs, together with the Catholic estates, managed to suppress the rebellion and restore peace once more to the Bohemian kingdom. And that is how the 30 Years' War ended in just 7 years. Oh wait, here come the Danish.
Yeah.
The Danish, expressing their support for the Protestant Union and thinking that the Habsburgs were easy to beat after their
You'll see that the Scandinavians, the Nordics, really get involved in all of this. We'll especially be talking about the Swedish in a little bit, but, bordering just north of these German countries, they've got sort of immediate interest here.
7-year exhausting war, launched their attack on the Catholic Holy Roman Empire. Needless to say, that didn't go too well. What is needful to say though, is that at this point, our Duke John George I saw an opportunity. The states switched fully Catholic and joined the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to fight the invading Danish. In the end, Saxony's sedition ended up becoming detrimental to the defeat of the Danish forces. And as a reward for being such a good Catholic boy, John ranked up to the title of Electorate, essentially becoming one of the 7 princes that could choose who the next emperor would be. How fancy. Anyway, that is how the 30 Years' War ended in just 11 years. Oh wait, here come the Swedish.
Here we go. Now look, the Danes, they gave it a shot. No offense, but they really do not match up to the Swedish in this conflict. They come in here like a wrecking ball, in large part due to the skill and talent of one Gustavus Adolphus.
The Swedish, as opposed to the Danish, actually knew how to fight a good old war. The wide use of muskets and smaller cannons made the Swedish a big problem for the Catholic Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs army. At this point, Elector John George I saw an opportunity. Saxony switched fully Protestant and joined the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus.
Yeah, maybe instead of centrist, flip-flopper would be the right term for Beer George. Alright, you can see here, he's always trying to hew one direction or another. He's trying to go wherever the wind blows, right? It serves him okay. Like I said, he's not the greatest leader of all time, but not the worst. And here we've got these Protestant Scandinavians getting involved. The Swedes under Gustavus Adolphus coming in and really kicking ass. And here, it's worth talking about the sort of damage that is done to these German lands, right? We haven't really covered it yet. I'm not sure if it is really within the scope of this video. But you can imagine, with all this war that's happening, and will last for 30 years, you've got armies marching back and forth, ravaging the same countryside, the same villages, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times, right? And what that does is it absolutely devastates the German population, devastates a lot of villages. Really, the scale of the devastation is sort of hard to communicate, And when we talk about absolute numbers, of course, this is the 17th century. The numbers will be far lower than later conflicts we'll see. But, the sort of scale of the devastation on the communities is really, really intense. A lot of communities entirely destroyed. You've got pestilence, you've got disease, famine throughout the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. Not everywhere, but throughout all of it, you have places that are really suffering quite badly.
In his war against the Catholics. Exactly why he betrayed the Holy Roman Empire is unclear, but some sources say it's because the Emperor's forces kept looting his villages. Initially, the war for the Protestants went well.
Well, I think there's some thought that John George, look, he's obviously sort of trying to position himself well. He sees initially the best way to do that is to side with the Catholics, right? But I think there's a thought that after doing that for a while, begins to feel uncomfortable with how badly they're treating the Protestants. And, he's sort of like, okay, I sort of made this political move, but I don't want this to be taken as sort of a religious move. So he switches to the Protestant side, back to the Protestant side.
I mean, it's no surprise really. The Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus was on top of his game.
Yeah.
No one could possibly...
But also, it might also be that John George just saw another opportunity and he took it. Maybe sort of ideology didn't come into it at all.
Peter D. Gus. Look at me, Catholic. The death of the Swedish king in the Battle of Lutzen and a couple other setbacks caused John to kind of lose faith in the Protestant rebellion. So back to Catholic the region switched and back to fighting along the Habsburgs he went. That didn't go too well. The Swedish were still really good at warfare, which is why Saxony experienced even more military setbacks. Wait, why is there a baguette here?
Ha! The French, right? Now, I've already given the game away, right? I've said how the French get involved. But just think to yourself, okay, the French are getting involved in this conflict. Of course they are. They are one of, if not the biggest Catholic power in Europe. Once again, the Habsburgs or the French, you decide. Of course they're going to get involved on the side of the Catholics. Everybody knows that. Well, they don't, right? Sort of shockingly, France gets in there. And I guess as we're seeing with Beer George, maybe ideology was not always the most important thing. For a lot of people, this was a very political conflict where they were trying to gain the upper hand. That is the case for France. They go, nah, we don't really want to side with the Catholics, all right? We've got this rivalry with the Habsburgs, with Austria. They're our enemies. We're hoping to get in here and sort of defeat them, right? We want to take some of their territory. We want to knock them down a peg. And so France gets involved.
The French, being done with Habsburg's global power and ready to spread France's influence, declared war on the Habsburgs dynasty, which meant declaring war against Spain, Italy, and against the Holy Roman Empire. Aren't we daring today, France? This is also the exact point in the 30 Years' War, where religion no longer was the sole reason for the war.
And it was never the sole reason, let's be honest, but I think you could make the argument that maybe it was the primary motivator early on, and it became less and less so throughout the conflict.
Power and influence became the prime factor.
Yeah.
John, for once, did not switch sides and stayed with the Catholics, where he continuously tried to fend off the Protestants, Swedish and French, with little success. Saxony suffered devastating territorial losses and got run over multiple times.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm talking about villages and territories that were trampled by armies, multiple times, well, Saxony, old John George's region, is one of those places.
John George, being a kind of opportunistic decision maker, for once couldn't switch or talk his way to the other side. Saxony's population suffered massively, and his economy declined severely. And this might have been a point in his life where drinking became more than a fun thing to do with friends. John drank. Maybe to get rid of the stress, maybe he just liked the taste of German.
Yeah, I think he was always a bit of a beer enjoyer, but perhaps it became more of an issue over time as things started to get worse for him.
Beer. But he drank, and drank, and drank, and eventually, as the story goes, he drank over 20 liters of alcohol on a day.
George.
That equals to roughly 80 beers in nowadays packages. When John wanted to get away from it all, he often went and stayed at his private vineyard, where you might have guessed, he made sure to taste and enjoy all the local wine. This excessive drinking earned John the nickname of Beer Jurgen.
Yeah.
Which might sound like a
or Beer George, as I've heard it.
fun nickname to have around the boys. But his wife Magdalena didn't find it funny in the slightest. She worried about the mental health and physical well-being of her husband.
Fair.
Originally, she wanted to confront her husband about it herself, but ultimately decided it would be better if the local pastor tried to talk sense to him instead. So, the following Sunday in church, the pastor preached to John that his excessive drinking was bad and that it was not only hurting him, but also the others around him.
Damn.
John, presumably...
Dude, talk about targeted advertising. Your priest is like, today we're going to talk about the issues with alcohol. You're sitting there like, uh-oh. Feels like this one's directed at me.
being a little tipsy, didn't take the pastor seriously and left the warning signs away. However, he did appreciate the pastor's good intentions. and to show him his appreciation, donated yearly to the local church.
Oh, that's nice.
Not with money, not with military power, but simply with wine. And not too much wine.
George.
Always exactly 49 3/4 barrels of wine. Because he didn't want the pastor to drink too much. What a funny guy he is. Wait, the war is over? Hooray! Turns out, while John was making love with his alcohol problem, the big forces all around Europe started to get kinda tired of all that fighting. After all, it's been 30 long years.
Yeah.
So they all came together and signed the Treaty of Westphalia, effectively initiating an era of peace.
Yeah, they sort of figured out that we can't always be killing each other for our religious differences. We're gonna have to work this out, okay? Now look, as we talked about, the war was maybe less and less about religion near the end of it, but that was one of the primary motivating factors, and so it leads them to the Treaty of Westphalia, which essentially allows a degree of religious toleration, and a lot of sort of legal scholars have argued, in some ways establishes sort of the modern idea of sovereignty, right? A state having sovereignty over its own affairs, over its own religion. And in some ways, that sort of evolves into the modern idea of sovereignty and having a modern sort of international community where states come together, they do diplomacy, they have conferences, but they maintain their own affairs and their own sovereignty. A lot of this reaches back to the Treaty of Westphalia.
And massively changing the political map of Europe.
Yeah.
What changed? In short, the Holy Roman Empire, together with the Habsburgs, lost their dominant position in Central Europe. And instead, the French became Europe's powerhouse. On top of that, the independent...
Yeah, maybe I've been saying that the Habsburgs and the French were competing to be the #1 Catholic power. Maybe this is the moment when it becomes clear that France will now be the #1 Catholic power. They've taken that crown from the Habsburgs.
The of Switzerland and the Dutch Republic was recognized. And Sweden gained some parts of Germany. But while all the big powers might have enjoyed the results of the war, it's important to note that the peasants were the one who really had to pay the price.
Yeah.
Around half the population of what is nowadays Germany died because of the many battles,
I mean, listen to that. That's insane. Half. Now, I know I've heard numbers as low as a third, as high as half, right? Either way, that's an incredible amount of death and destruction, and also dependent on the region, right? I mean, some places may have had relatively low casualties. I guess, I don't know if 25% is low, it's pretty high, but, you know, maybe you've got 20, 10%, whatever, you've got relatively low casualties. Some places you're talking 30, some places 50, some towns, maybe not entire regions, but some places, they saw their entire population wiped out, like 90, 95%, right? So you're talking really intense devastation, somewhere between a third and a half throughout all of these different German lands.
And diseases. Hey, what happened to perhaps the most drunken character in our war history? Well, you probably think that he died of alcohol poisoning, but miraculously he did not. He lived healthy, though really fat, till the age of 71, which is a good age around that time.
Yeah, not bad.
After his passing, his eldest son took over, and slowly but surely, the Holy Roman Empire started to crumble throughout the years. This is the story of the deadly 30 Years' War and a drunken boy.
There we go. I enjoyed that one. First time watching historically. I'm glad we got a chance to talk about the 30 Years' War. We're going to do more of it. I'd like to do extra history series on the 30 Years' War. A really fascinating fundamental conflict for the formation of modern Europe and, of course, the modern world sort of broadly. I think you can see that I like that Beer George became a sort of central part of the story here. I think you can see, you know, I think I was fair to say that he was not the greatest of all leaders, but was not the worst, right? He was a bit opportunistic, sort of riding the centrist line. In the end, even though he took those opportunities, sort of wanted everything to be done with. You know, he was sort of done with the war, wanted peace in the end. Someone who ruled okay, relatively okay. He lived a few years after the end of the 30 Years' War, right? So, you know, definitely an interesting character, Beer George. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, you could leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, link down below, to give you access to exclusive reaction content. Now, with all of that, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.